everyone, and welcome to May's History at High Noon, Sioux City in the 1890s, the first of our Decade series. Now, as is so often with history, the story I want to tell doesn't really fit nicely in the 1890s. This is an era of big booming for Sioux City, but that boom actually started earlier, back in 1887, and kind of halted with the Panic of 1893. And then there was a small reorganization and rebirth period in the later 1890s. So this talk is actually going to come in two parts, one of 1887 to 1893, and then from 1893 to 1897. One big thing that happens in this boom era that I'm not really going to talk about are the yearly corn palaces. Every year from 1887 to 1891, Sioux City had a harvest festival in which they built a massive corn palace. We already have a talk on the corn palaces, so I'm not going to go into too much detail of them here. And there's lots of things that I have in this talk that I don't go into as much detail as I would like to, simply because we already have talks for them. But just know the corn palaces were definitely a thing. They occurred every year. And their biggest promotion was bringing people from the East, people from New York and Boston, and bringing them here to invest in Sioux City and its businesses and industries. So before we get into the what, let's go into the who, the boomers of this boom era. If there's any man who can be said to best exemplify Sioux City's boom era, that man would be Arthur Samuel Garretson. He'd been in Sioux City since 1874, and he'd had a hand in pretty much every single project that I'm going to go into in this talk. At the height of his wealth, he was worth $16 million, which is 1/5 of the wealth of J.P. Morgan. And he's right here in Sioux City, and he was only 40, so pretty incredible dude here. He owned land locally. He also owned gold and silver mines out in California and down in Colombia, South America. He also has the honor of having the largest ranch in Iowa, down near Luton, at over 3,000 acres. To find Garretson's influence, just look for his name. He built the Hotel Garretson at 5th and Peirce, and he also built the Garretson Mansion down in Morningside, which is where the library is today. Another name that might be familiar to many people is John Peirce. He'd been in Sioux City in 1869, and he'd been working on railroads. And in this era, he gets especially involved in real estate, though like Garretson and like all of the other boomers, he had his hands in all sorts of different things. But he's a key developer of the North Side. He'd built up the neighborhood of Ingleside, where he had his own home at 21st and Ingleside Boulevard, which was built in 1870. Peirce's partner is D.T. Hedges. He'd been here a long time. He'd come to Sioux City in the mid-1860s selling general merchandise, and in this era he's involved in meatpacking, real estate, transit, and many other things. E.C. Peters is the key developer of Morningside. He'd come to Sioux City in 1870, and he'd built his big mansion out in Morningside in 1872 and set about developing Morningside, especially in this time period. Ed Hawkinson, he was a major developer of the town of Sloan, Iowa, and he'd come to Sioux City from there in 1883. At the time of the boom era, he was Sioux City's largest meatpacker when he purchased the old Fowler plant in 1889, and you can see his meatpacking complex here. And here are some other guys. You may hear their names: W.W. Byam, William Gordon, Fred T. Evans, Charles Hoyt, and the Peavey brothers, though Frank Peavey was actually in Minneapolis for most of this time. He is still investing heavily down here in Sioux City. So one of the biggest industries in Sioux City is our railroads. Railroads are how the city grows and how it maintains its growth once it is there. In 1892, there were at least 30 trains arriving and departing from Sioux City every day. I've seen some sources say as high as 60, and over 80,000 carloads of freight to and from local industries. Most of those trains for passengers stop at the Union Depot Hotel near 2nd and Jackson Street. This was the passenger stations for most rail lines up until 1893 when it was replaced, and we'll talk about that here in just a minute. So what lines are actually feeding the city? Well, you have the Dubuque and Sioux City and the Sioux City and Iowa Falls. This is part of the Illinois Central System, and these were built in 1870. You have the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul, also called the Milwaukee Road. This came to Sioux City in 1887 after it had purchased two local companies, the Dakota Southern and the Sioux City and Pembina. This makes Sioux City a key route on this line up into South Dakota. One of those local companies, the Dakota Southern, had built the railroad bridge across the Big Sioux River near the Military Road Bridge. That railroad bridge is still there. At least the bridge that is there today, I'm almost certain, is still the one that was built in 1872. And the Milwaukee has its own passenger depot and freight depot, as well as its own shops down at 3rd and Division. Here's an image of its passenger depot, which was complete in 1887. And we also have the Chicago Northwestern system. This is one of the largest railroad systems in the United States at this time. It had purchased the local Sioux City and Pacific and Sioux City and St. Paul. To charter a route from Omaha up to the Twin Cities, the Northwestern made the Chicago, Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Omaha Road, which had come into Sioux City in 1888. This gave Sioux City a connection to the Union Pacific down in Omaha. So to get across the Missouri River, the Chicago Northwestern built a railroad bridge, and this opened in December of 1888. It had 4 300-foot spans. However, the Northwestern, in a break of contract, did not allow other lines to use this bridge for a fair price. So Sioux City boomers were looking to build another bridge elsewhere on the Missouri River for use of other local and national rail lines. And here you can see a view of the completed Chicago Northwestern Bridge out near the Packing District. Chicago Northwestern had its own depot built in 1889 as the Sioux City and Pacific. It also had its own freight depot and the shops in 1885 that were built for the Sioux City and St. Paul. These were on Howard Street, which is the rail yards near Floyd Boulevard today. Now, there are two new local railroad companies emerging in this time period. One is the Sioux City and Northern that goes from Merrill, Iowa, up to Palisades, South Dakota, which was renamed Garretson when the rail was built there. Guess who was the major financier behind this one? This gave Sioux City a route up to Duluth, Minnesota, which has a connection to global markets via the St. Lawrence Seaway, so putting Sioux City on the global market through that route. And the other big project is the Pacific Short Line, also called the Sioux City, O'Neill, and Western. This would go from Sioux City across the Missouri River over to O'Neill, Nebraska, where it meets up with the Fremont, Elkhorn, and Missouri Valley Railroad. This gives Sioux City a route over to the Pacific without needing to go through Omaha. It was a very ambitious project for its time. However, because the Pacific Short Line can't use the Chicago Northwestern Bridge, they set about designing their own. This bridge would serve both rail as well as wagon and pedestrian traffic, a combination bridge, if you will. We also had the Union Terminal Railroad Company, of which Arthur S. Garretson was president, and this set about revitalizing Sioux City's Union facilities. We had the Union Freight House, and built in 1880 at 2nd and Iowa, and the Union Passenger Depot at 3rd and Douglas, which was finished in 1893. As Sioux City increases as a rail center, we also have a massive growth of population in this time period. In 1885, we numbered just under 20,000. By 1892, estimates were anywhere from 54 to 60,000. It's important to note that less than 10% of that population is foreign-born, though some of them may be first-generation Americans. Sioux City did not have a big spike of immigrants until later on in its history. The city limits also expanded in this time period, once in 1888 and then again in 1890. These city limits lasted up until the 1950s. And with this growth of the city limits, you have neighborhoods being built where they never could be before. And this era sees an emerging relationship between neighborhoods and transit that we don't really see in periods earlier to this. John Peirce is quoted as saying, "Street and cable car lines are built into the territories that have no residents, and then residents follow once the transit lines are built." So there's a relationship between neighborhoods, how they grow, and the transit lines that are feeding those neighborhoods back into the business district downtown. The oldest of these transit lines was the Sioux City Street Railway Company, which was incorporated in 1883. This was a project by Fred T. Evans, though James Peavey would later buy it. This line was electrified in 1890 from horse-drawn streetcars to electric trolley cars, and these are important for what we now call the near side neighborhoods of Sioux City. Here you can see a map of the street railway in 1893, and then you have that lower line feeding the Davis and Hornick additions, the commercial district along West 7th Street, and that upper line there feeds the Smithville neighborhood. You have the Pearl Street line here feeding that commercial district, and at the top of the Pearl Street line is the newly platted neighborhood of Rose Hill. The Peirce Street line, Jennings Street line, the Court Street line, which feeds up into Ingleside, and there's even a line feeding the River Bottoms neighborhoods down near the Packing District. The street railway also connects to Evans Driving Park, which was built in 1887 and named after Fred T. Evans. This was one of Sioux City's earliest sporting arenas, and it featured a half-mile racetrack and a baseball diamond in the center. The racetrack was normally used for trotting races using sulkies like you see here. That baseball diamond was home to the Sioux City Cornhuskers, who played in the Western League from 1888 to 1891, and then were revitalized again in 1894. And in this period, you have the growth of what we call satellite neighborhoods, neighborhoods that exist far out of downtown and are therefore very reliant on using transit to connect it back into downtown. The advantage of having large neighborhoods outside of the main commercial district is that they allow for very large lots and very large homes on those lots. So that's what I mean by satellite neighborhoods. The earliest of these was Highland Park, platted by W.W. Byam, and his transit line was the Sioux City and Highland Park Railway Company, incorporated in 1886. This was a steam motor line that had two halves, a northern half and a southern half, as you can see here on this map. The northern half, which fed the platted portion of Highland Park, Byam built his house there on California Avenue. And then you had the lower portion feeding into Riverside Park, which Byam had designed as kind of a playground for the fine Victorian mansions that were going to be in his West Side Highland Park. Unfortunately, Byam was a little overinvested and overbuilt, and so the Sioux City and Highland Park Railway Company went bankrupt. And once the transit line fell, there was no way to feed the neighborhood back into downtown. So nothing really became of Highland Park in this time period. The lower portion of the rail was electrified and became the Riverside Park Railway, and became very important for ferrying people over to Riverside Park for various purposes. Here you can see the lower portion of the Highland Park Railway feeding out to Riverside Park just before it was electrified in 1891. And here are some shots of Riverside Park at this time period. The Sioux City Boat Club was out there, as well as a couple other boat clubs. And in this image, you can see the Switchback Pleasure Railway in the background, that big roller coaster, as well as picnickers and horse riding and all kinds of fun being had in Riverside Park. Another satellite neighborhood is Peirce's Addition, which was platted in 1886. This stands as the largest single addition ever platted for Sioux City at over 1,000 acres, and it really shows the ambition of the boomers in this time period. At the very northern end of the addition, you guys can see Central Park, which had a pavilion and various walking trails. Peirce was so ambitious with his new neighborhood and with the growth of Sioux City that he thought Central Park was going to be the center of this new thriving metropolis of Sioux City, and that Sioux City was just going to keep growing out and forever onwards. So they charted their main thoroughfare up into Peirce's Addition as Jackson Street. However, there's a problem with building on Jackson Street. If you drive it every single day like I do, you will know that starting at about 5th Street, you go up this absolutely massive hill, which I have affectionately dubbed Mount Jackson. This hill goes all the way up to 8th Street and provides quite the obstacle if you want to connect a North Side neighborhood down into downtown with a transit line. So what do? Well, you build a cable car. The Sioux City Cable Railway began operation in May of 1889, and it went on Jackson Street from 3rd up to Peirce's Central Park at 40th Street. Central Park, by the way, is where the Country Club Clubhouse is today. There was a powerhouse with the cable line at 29th and Jones, which you can see better here on this map. The 29th and Jones powerhouse is that bottom image. This powerhouse had its own generators to run the cable line, and so you could actually wire electricity to homes in Peirce's edition using this powerhouse as well. Naturally, both Hedges and Peirce built their houses on this line. The Hedges home, which was finished in 1889, and just a block north was Peirce's house, which took a lot longer because he wanted a large stone mansion rather than just an ordinary house. So here you can see a picture of the construction of the Peirce mansion in late 1892. And over in Morningside, you have a satellite neighborhood growing called Peters Park, named after E.C. Peters and his land out in Morningside. Development didn't really start out in Peters Park until people like Garretson moved out there in the late 1880s. And they also have an issue with trying to connect their neighborhood to downtown. They're separated not by a hill, but by the entire Floyd River and Packing District. So they have to figure out a way to navigate this massive commercial space using a transit line. And so their model was the Sioux City Rapid Transit Company, which was incorporated in 1888, and they built their transit line in two parts, a surface portion from East End over to Leech, and then an elevated portion over to 3rd and Jones Street. The construction of this elevated railroad made Sioux City the third elevated railroad in the entire world, and the first electrified in 1892. And here you can see an image of the surface line in Peters Park from Garretson's front yard. People living out there include James A. Jackson, his son-in-law Judge Wilson, F.M. Pelletier, and you can just see this station for the transit line off to the right there. And here's a view of the elevated portion of that line at Division Street, where the line turns to go to Leech and then down to the surface. With the growth of Morningside, we have the development of the University of the Northwest, which was created in 1890 with the Methodist Episcopal Church. Peters himself donated over 23 acres of land for the college campus and invested heavily in its capital and real estate. The first school year was 1890 to 1891 and featured 150 students, even though none of the buildings were complete yet. Here you can see an image of the construction of the College of Technology, which is today Charles City Hall, in late 1890. It did eventually open in 1891, though the interior portions weren't quite complete yet. Morningside finally had a campus building by then, after the school year had started. And the last satellite neighborhood we have is Leeds, and Leeds is a weird one for two reasons. When Leeds was founded by the Leeds Land Improvement Company in April of 1889, it was not platted as an addition to Sioux City, it was platted as its own town. And so it didn't have the reliance on transit that came with these satellite neighborhoods. Instead, Leeds grew because of its manufacturing and featured itself as an English-style manufacturing hub, though Leeds was incorporated into the Sioux City limits in October of 1890 when the city limits expanded. And some of the largest industries in Sioux City of this time period are located in Leeds. We have the Daniel Peirce, or the Sioux City Stove Works. Daniel Peirce was a New York company that made the factory here. And by 1890, they employed over 600 men, and that's probably a lower estimate. You also had the engine works, the Great Northern Mill, several manufactories, and even a brickyard. Here you can see the construction of the Sioux City Engine and Iron Works, with the Leeds neighborhood in the background. This site is now occupied by American Popcorn. Once Leeds was incorporated, we needed a transit line to service it into Sioux City, and so the Sioux City and Leeds Electric Railway was founded in January of 1892. Unlike the others, this was electric from the start and featured electric trolleys immediately and stopped right at the end of Floyd Boulevard. One thing that's characteristic of Sioux City in this boom era is the numerous building projects that are going on in this time period. There's a massive building boom going on in all sectors of town, both in these new neighborhoods and in downtown. With the neighborhoods, you have a massive increase in student population, and so you have the construction of a lot of new schools. Between 1887 and 1892, there were at least 12 new or improved brick schools that were built here in Sioux City, including this one, Bancroft, or the Pearl Street School, which was built in 1888 by E.W. Loft. And you can see with this architecture, as you'll see in other buildings, just the true spirit of Sioux City's boom era, these large, massive buildings with tall towers and nice Romanesque windows that really send a statement of this time period in Sioux City. Now, in the late 1880s, the school district has a problem. Armstrong School, which had been used as the Sioux City High School, is far, far too small to meet the new student population, and so the site of the J.L. Follett home at 12th and Nebraska was purchased for construction of a new high school building that would service Sioux City students. So construction on Sioux City High School started in 1891 and was complete just after the panic in May of 1893, and this, again, is a great example of what I mean by sending a statement through architecture. This Sioux City High School is built in a castle-like structure and features strong Richardsonian Romanesque elements. Those rounded, that rounded entryway and the rounded bell tower, and that rough-cut stone. So it's fascinating to see such a big, massive castle-like structure, sending a statement to just how Sioux City boomers think Sioux City is doing in this great time period. With the growth of schools, neighborhoods, you also have a lot of new churches being founded. Between 1887 and 1892, at least 23 new church buildings were built, either for existing congregations or for brand new congregations to the city. One of those buildings was the St. Boniface Catholic Church on West 5th Street, which was built in 1889 and served as Sioux City's second ever Catholic church. In 1887, Sioux City only had one Catholic church, St. Mary's. By 1892, it had four: St. Mary's, St. Boniface, St. Jean, and St. Joseph. So that gives you an idea of how these new buildings are servicing Sioux City's new growing community. The two largest church projects of this time period were St. Thomas Episcopal and St. Mary's Catholic, both of which are still standing. St. Mary's is now, of course, the Cathedral of the Epiphany. These were both complete in 1892. And St. Thomas, like Sioux City High School, features a lot of that great Richardsonian Romanesque architecture popular in Sioux City in this time period. In this area, you also see a lot of improvement on 4th Street. 4th Street had been made Sioux City's major business avenue in the early 1880s, and in the boom era, 1887 to 1892, at least 14 new buildings were added to 4th Street. The 4th Street Viaduct was also complete in 1892, connecting the east side of 4th Street over to the east side of Sioux City. I can't go through all of them, but here are a couple of significant ones. The Metropolitan Block, which was considered Sioux City's first skyscraper, the Major Block, which held the College of Commerce of the University of Northwest, and the Evans Block, which is Heidman Law Firm today, home to Fred T. Evans Northwestern National Bank. A lot of these buildings on 4th Street were built by the Boston Investment Company. This, as its name implies, was a company funded by Eastern investors to fund building projects here in Sioux City. These investors were largely invited and managed by William Gordon and A.S. Garretson. They built a lot of buildings on what we now call historic 4th Street, like this Boston block, which most of you know as the Alfs Building at 4th and Virginia. This was complete in 1890. Another major construction project, the Peavey Grand Opera House, which opened in 1888 and was funded by the Peavey brothers, Frank and James. This was meant to be a house for the Sioux City Chamber of Commerce as well as a theater, and as design went on, the theater kind of dominated the space, with the Chamber of Commerce taking up some of the smaller office spaces near the front of the building. And here you can see the inside of the Peavey Grand Opera House from the second floor balcony. A major project of A.S. Garretson's at the time was the library building, also called the Municipal building, at 6th and Douglas Street, where the police and fire station is today. This was built in 1892, and it was primarily for the library, but it also has the distinction of being the first building ever just built for city offices. So the offices of the mayor, the waterworks, and what have you, all of these were housed inside of this building. So we have buildings and we need businesses to go inside of them. And so I'll talk here now about some of the businesses and industries that are growing rapidly with Sioux City's expansion. Of course, as with much of Sioux City's history, the name of the game is meatpacking. In this boom era, Sioux City was the 5th meatpacking center in the world, and the meat district is managed by the Union Stockyards Company, which was founded in 1884 by Ed Hawkinson, D.T. Hedges, A.S. Garretson, and Fred Evans. By 1890, the Union Stockyards was handling over $9 million worth of stock per year, and it's continuing to grow and expand in this era, improving its packing plants and stockyards and other packing facilities. Speaking of the packing houses, there were 4 in Sioux City at this time. The Silverhorn Packing Company, owned by a Chicago firm, Hawkinson's Packing Company, which was sold to Cudahy in late 1892, and they began that slow transition to move in early on in 1893. When Cudahy bought the plant, Ed Hawkinson continued to run the beef section of his plant as Sioux City Dressed Beef and Canning Company, while Cudahy mainly handled the pork side of the business. You have A. Heller and Sons, who are sausage makers, and Sioux City Packing Company, which had purchased the old Bogue plant in 1892. Sioux City's on the Corn Belt, and therefore the things grown in that Corn Belt are vitally important to our economy. So as far as agriculture goes, our trade area produced 1/4 of the U.S. corn yield, 1/5 of the U.S. wheat yield, and almost half of all of U.S. flax production. Flax and linseed are used in various chemical processes to make things like paint. The Sioux City Linseed Oil Works, which was rebuilt after the fire in 1890, which was the largest linseed oil plant in the United States. This building is still there. It is the offices of State Steel today. Brick and stoneware are especially prominent in Sioux City due to all the clay beds of the Loess Hills, and Sioux City's yards were producing brick, tile, paving bricks, sewer pipes. By the end of 1892, they had a capacity of over 240,000 brick and over 5,000 feet of tile produced in our brickyards. So definitely a major industry for Sioux City. To give you this idea of a scale of these operations, this is the Sioux City Brick and Tile plant out in Springdale, which was built in 1886. Now, agriculture, meatpacking, and brick and stoneware, these are things that grow in Sioux City largely because of where we are and our geography. But in this time period, the United States and Sioux City along with it sees a significant growth in manufacturing industries. I've already mentioned the Leeds industries, but you have things like American Biscuit, Hanford's Produce, Novelty Manufacturing. A lot of manufacturing firms that become major players in Sioux City's economy later on are setting down these roots in this time period and expanding rapidly through this boom era. Some other manufacturers, the Sioux City Vinegar and Pickling Works, which had moved to the brand new suburb of North Riverside in 1890, the Great Northern Mills, and the Sioux City Plow Works, again showing our vital connection to agriculture. Now, Sioux City is also known for its wholesaling firms, and this is steadily increasing in this time period. However, they would become much bigger players in Sioux City's economy later on. So there are wholesalers here. They are doing a lot of business, and it is an important industry, but it's not the big major player of our economy that it would become in later decades. Some other names that might be familiar to some of you, Chesterman and Lane, which had been Chesterman and Barrow, formed in 1891, though they are not bottling Coca-Cola yet. Still an important bottling firm here in Sioux City. And Beacon's Brothers, Beacon's Moving and Storage, came here in 1891 from Grand Rapids, Michigan, and they specialized in moving things like safes and boilers and pianos and other things that are hard to move. And I just wanted to give a glance of Sioux City in 1892. So if you lived in Sioux City in 1892, what would your life look like? What would it be like as far as daily life goes? So for city government, if you live in Sioux City, you live in one of 6 wards, and every year you would go to the municipal building and cast your vote for an alderman to represent you on that ward. Aldermen report to the mayor, who at this time is E.C. Palmer. County government, you go to the county courthouse at 6th and Peirce Street. Just like today, the county courthouse is run by a elected board of supervisors. There is a municipal fire department under Chief George Kellogg, and there are 4 fire stations that house 2 chemical, 2 hook and ladder, and 3 hose companies inside them. Here you can see a hook and ladder company display out in front of fire station number 1 down on Water Street. This building is still there. It is hydraulic sales and service today. There's also a municipal police department. However, the police department has the issue of Sioux City is growing faster than its police force is. To serve a town of 54,000, the entire police force numbers 25 men, including the chief. So that's kind of an interesting problem that arises in this boom era. If you do live in 1892, though, and you're walking along 3rd Street, you will see this building under construction, the police headquarters, again in that great Richardsonian Romanesque style architecture. There are 2 hospitals serving the city, St. Joseph Mercy up on Ingleside after Peirce sold his estate to the Sisters of Mercy. That has a capacity of 200 patients. And the relatively new Samaritan Hospital on Peirce Street, which has a capacity of 25. If you have need for a cemetery, you'll probably go to Floyd. However, there are some private cemeteries, 2 Jewish ones and 1 St. Mary's Catholic cemetery. This would later be renamed Calvary. You also have Logan Park opening up in April of 1892 as a private cemetery. This had been a real estate subdivision that was reincorporated into a cemetery. There are several parks around the city. However, it's important to note in this time period, a city park is not a thing. Any parks that exist in the city are privately owned and privately maintained. So Evans, Riverside, and Central we've talked about already. You also have Peters Park out in Morningside Avenue, Westside Park, which is near where Cook Park is today, and Children's Park out in Smith Villa. If you have children, you could send them to one of our 28 or 5 parochial schools in 1892. If you chose to send your students to high school, you don't have to. It's not compulsory. But if you did, you'd send them to Armstrong while Sioux City High School is under construction. And if you chose to pursue higher education, you could go to the University of the Northwest or the Northwestern Business College down on 4th Street, which teaches things like shorthand, business management, and those kinds of classes. Chances are you're using one of our 19 banks, maybe Security National Bank, which gets a nice brand new building in early 1893. However, if investing is on your mind, you could invest in one of our several loan and trust companies, which take money, hold it in trust, and then turn it into things like businesses and buildings and turn you the profits later. So if you're walking or driving around on our streets, we have 25 miles of paved streets located mainly in the business districts. These are paved not in concrete, but largely with cedar pavers, though some of them would be brick. You also have true boardwalks, sidewalks lining those streets made out of wood. You need to send a message, you can go to one of our 3 telegraph companies around town. However, if you're swanky and rich, you can take advantage of our telephone exchange. The Iowa Union Telephone Company ran out of the Hedges block, which you can see at 4th and Douglas Street. Chances are, if you're using a telephone, you're probably part of a business and making business calls. It'd be pretty rare in this time period for you to have a telephone in your house, though if you're the upper 1% of Sioux City's population, you may have one of these hand-cranked telephones. Also relatively new in this time period, we get long-distance service out to Lamar's and Orange City, so that's really exciting. You may not have a telephone, but you would be pretty much guaranteed to have running water. The Sioux City Waterworks had been founded in 1885 and was well established by 1892. Serving the waterworks is this reservoir up at 24th and Douglas, today Grandview Park, which is exactly where the reservoirs are in Grandview Park today. But this is an open reservoir and has 500,000 gallons. And Light and street lights and residential lights undergo an interesting transition in this time period. Most lights, street lights and residential lights, are supplied by the Sioux City Gas Light Company, which was founded in 1872. They make manufactured gas, so they burn coal, store the gas produced from that burning in that big gasometer that you can see on the left of the picture, and then send it through pipes around the city to where it needs to go. But you live in 1892 and get to take advantage of this newfangled contraption called electricity. So you have the Sioux City Electric Company, which had been founded in 1888. If you live near one of their 2 power plants and can afford to wire your house to them, you could have electric lights in your home. Or if you live near a electric transit station, you could wire your home from there. A lot of light fixtures in this time period actually service both electricity and gas. Here you can see one in our back storage room. The blue there has a gas pipe for a gas light, and you can see an electrical socket circled there in red. And you can see this better in person. This is William Gordon's dining room, and you notice the light fixture in this dining room has both gas sockets, so the gas bulbs stick up there and have the little valves in the U-shape on the bottom, whereas the electric ones kind of hang out over the side, and they have electrical sockets inside them. If you lived in 1892, you would also be exposed to the massive Floyd River flood. This is one of the deadliest disasters in Sioux City history, killing at least 25, probably more. Records like that weren't kept as well back then, and left thousands more homeless. It was estimated 400 to 500 homes were completely swept away into the Missouri River, most of them in the Meatpacking and Bottoms districts, like you can see here on 4th Street looking from Chambers. Here's another image of the flood down on what is today Historic 4th, looking from the Heidman Law Firm building. You notice now the problem with cedar paved streets is that when the floodwaters come, those cedar pavers kind of float away. The Floyd River flood was especially devastating to the Union Stockyards Company. It completely wiped out their animal holding pens and caused significant damage to the meat district as a whole. So the Union Stockyards was forced to move downrivers to the old Central Stockyards plant, and set about making massive expansions and revitalizing our meat industry. And they might have gotten farther had it not been for the economic panic of 1893. This was a massive economic depression that struck the United States in early 1893 and lasted until about 1898, with a particularly bad spike in 1896. The panic is actually fascinating. It was the worst economic disaster in Sioux City history, in Sioux City and American history, until 1929. And I can't go too much into the causes and what exactly happened, but it was a major economic hard time for everyone. Over 15,000 businesses failed, 500 banks closed. Unemployment reached anywhere from 17 to 19%, though in some places like New York, it was as high as 45%. There was a massive railroad bubble that had burst in this time period. Railroads were overbuilt, overextended, and no longer making their returns. And so when they go into receivership, it essentially means the rail company is bankrupt, but the railroad is still continuing to run. When they go into receivership, there was an estimated loss of over $1.8 billion, and that's not adjusted for inflation. And that's just an absolutely staggering amount of money. With all the business closures and people not having any money with the banks closed, this led to strikes and riots around the country, including the Pullman Company strike in Chicago, which was so violent and had to be broken up by the U.S. Army. To overcome this economic disaster, the government required a $65 million bailout, largely paid by J.P. Morgan, and will require several more until 1898, when the economy is getting more back on its feet. So the panic was especially devastating for Sioux City because once people in the East start losing all their money and their businesses fail, they can no longer afford to keep investing in Sioux City businesses. So the panic is said to hit Sioux City in force April 15th, 1893, when the Union Loan and Trust Company failed. This was a large trust company that had taken money from out east and funded things like the Union Stockyards, the Sioux City and Northern Railroad, Sioux City Dress Beef and Canning, the Pacific Short Line, and its combination bridge. All of these companies completely ceased functioning with the collapse of this Union Loan and Trust Company. There were several Sioux City people who had a personal stake in this Union Loan and Trust Company: D.T. Hedges, A.S. Garretson, John Hornick, Ed Hawkinson. And so they lost substantial amount of their fortune when this company went under as well. And the Union Loan and Trust is just a particularly large trust company in Sioux City. All of Sioux City's businesses, for the most part, were dependent somehow on these trust companies. So when they start failing, this is extremely, extremely taxing for the city's economy. Hundreds of businesses firms failed, including all of the Leeds Land and Improvement Company, the Silberhorn Packing Company, the University of the Northwest, and half of Sioux City's population left. In 1892, we were estimated anywhere from 54 to 60,000. By 1895, we numbered 27,000 people. Among those who left were D.T. Hedges, W.W. Byam, James Peavey, and other boomers. John Peirce tried to restart himself several times over the years, but eventually he gave up around 1901 and left Sioux City for Seattle, Washington, not before raffling off his large Peirce mansion in a lottery drawing in 1900. So, massive economic panic. How do you get yourself out of this one? Well, in November 4th, 1893, the Credits Commutation Company was formed. This is a company that formed out east from the investors that had poured money into the Union Loan and Trust Company. And then they're faced with two options: either take a massive loss or take the things they had invested in and make them turn a profit to help get some of their money back. So they sent secretary and general manager of the company, Fred Eaton, to Sioux City. And once Eaton got here, he saw he had two major tasks to complete. Their first was to completely reorganize the meat industry, which had fallen apart with the collapse of the Union stockyards. So in 1894, he founded the Sioux City Stockyards Company. And by the end of 1894, Sioux City's meat industry had a new exchange building, 4 meat packers, 100 acres of yards, and over 12,000 cars worth of receipts. Here you can see the new livestock exchange building that was built by the Stockyards Company, and the new Herney Packing Company, which had come in 1894. So through this economic hardships, the Sioux City meat industry was totally reorganized and emerged as a much more stable and long-lasting institution that would forever be a major, major part of our economy. Eaton's task number 2 was to finish the combination bridge, which had halted all construction when the panic started. 4 out of the 7 necessary piers were sunk, and none of the ironwork was done yet, so he had quite the task on his hands. He formed the Combination Bridge Company in 1895, and using some capital raised from citizen taxes, he finally sunk the final 7th pier in October. And it just completely blows my mind to see pictures of how this combination bridge was constructed in the late 1890s. These massive caissons were built onshore and then hauled outriver, and then sunk into the river to create a nice watertight seal. Once the caisson is sunk, these crews called sandhogs were lowered into it and were told to dig out the riverbed with the shovel until they hit bedrock 75 feet below. And they could then fill that with concrete, and then there is your nice new pier. Once the piers are done, the ironwork goes together amazingly quickly. These two pictures are taken a week apart in October of 1895, completely constructing one of the fixed spans of the bridge. The bridge finally opened for traffic in January 21st, 1896, and here you can see in this image the first rail and the first trolley car going across the rails. When it was constructed, this combination bridge served rail, trolley, pedestrian, and wagon and buggy traffic. And here's a view of all 4 spans of the bridge with its engineers sitting out in front. And so with that reorganization process comes a new process of rebirth for Sioux City, lasting into the later 1890s. Out of the ashes of the University of the Northwest came Morningside College, which was incorporated in 1894. The college still had a massive debt and faced several financial difficulties until 1897, when Reverend Wilson Seeley Lewis was elected president. He launched massive fundraising programs to repay a lot of the college's debt and set about making improvements to both the college's campus buildings and to its programs. One of his accomplishments was Main Hall, which is Lewis Hall today, which was finally complete in 1900. Other new buildings going up around town: the YMCA building, funded largely by A.S. Garretson at 7th and Peirce Street. This was made in late 1893, and you can tell it's made after the panic because down on that lower floor there, you can see there's that nice rough-cut stone so common in this architecture, and from everything else up, it is the much, much cheaper brick construction. So this YMCA would last until the 1950s when the new one was built. The Federal Building, which was a major construction project here in Sioux City in this in these 1890s time period. This was constructed at 6th and Douglas and built to house the federal courts and offices. There was also a post office in the basement, and so I will forever call this building the post office when I don't call it City Hall. You'll notice there is no clock on the clock tower. This was an addition that was added much later in the building's life. You have some new businesses popping out. It's actually amazing how many of our large industries actually survived. A linseed oil mill, almost all banks, mills, brickyards, wholesalers, all of these survived the panic. And you have many more reorganized as different firms with new business strategies, investing not so much money in these loan and trust companies and forming a more firm foundation for these businesses. Some of the new businesses incorporated in this time period: the Sioux City Brass Works, expanding our electrical supply; Sioux City Starch Factory; Parsons Pelletier. Pelletier will become much more important in the next talk. And the Martins Brothers Sioux City Roller Mills, taking advantage of new grain milling technology. There's also a large steel gasometer added to the Sioux City Gas Light Company, which allowed for more improved gas works. And F.L. Eaton formed an independent telephone company, the Home Telephone Company, in 1893, and it lasted until 1898 when it merged with the Iowa Union Telephone Company. And here you can see the switchboards of the Home Telephone Company in 1895. The transit companies had to be completely reorganized after the panic. Every single one of them went bankrupt and went into smaller companies and receivers. One of these electrified the cable railway in 1894, tearing up that cable and turning it into an electric trolley car. And in 1899, the Sioux City Traction Company was organized. So all of those little businesses that were owning the traction companies came together into one firm and consolidated all the lines and set about making improvements to our transit lines in later decades. And despite all the economic hardships, you still see this air of celebration and spirit within Sioux City people everywhere you look. On August 20th, 1895, the 91st anniversary of his death, Sergeant Charles Floyd was reburied and his grave marked with a stone slab marker. This was a massive ceremony with an attendance of over 500, inviting people from all over the world to come here to Sioux City and honor Sergeant Charles Floyd. You had the Sioux City Fair from 1895 and 1896. This was held in Riverside Park and featured agricultural exhibits and interesting entertainment like this massive train crash that was the highlight of the 1896 fair. But the true spiritual successor to the Corn Palaces was the Mondayman Carnivals, which started in 1897. These featured concerts, exhibitions, but the big draw was the parade that was held every year. Here you can see floats for Haskins Beat 'em All soap. Nice advertisement for Haskins Brothers there. And this elaborately decorated Peace Queen float. The 1898 carnival was called the Jubilee of Peace to celebrate the end of the Spanish-American War. And I just want to leave you with one of my absolute favorite images of our collection, showing 4th Street in this era, looking east from Peirce Street. Here you can see trolley cars and horse-drawn vehicles and all of these beautiful buildings exemplifying downtown Sioux City, and you'd never guess that it had just gone through so much economic hardship. With the reorganization and rebirth processes that took place throughout the later 1890s, Sioux City could look ahead to the greater decades with a nice firm hope for the future. And you'll hear more about those later decades as we continue on this series. In June, we're going to have Sioux City in the 1900s, and we'll continue on into the 1910s and 1920s and go from there. So thank you very much for joining me. Hope you all are staying safe, and we hope to see you in the museum again real soon.